In this module, we're going to discuss worker mobility and migration. We've talked about mobility a little bit already, and we've talked about migration a little bit as well, but we'll talk about both in a little bit more detail in this case and draw some models that will help us understand the effects of mobility and the effects of migration or immigration. When we talk about migration, we're not simply talking about moving from one country to another. That would be expressly immigration, but we're talking about moving from one place to another. So mobility and migration are very closely connected. Migration becomes immigration when we move from one polity to another. So in this module, we'll talk about mobility and generally talk about issues of migration, including immigration. But we'll do so in a way that hopefully will help you more clearly see some of the realities of the current debate that we find in our country and in our labor markets regarding the effects of immigration on workers' wages. So as we discuss worker mobility and migration, we're going to be discussing the decision to migrate or immigrate. We'll look at various immigration statistics. We'll look at changes in labor supply, and we'll give some consideration to current thoughts on migration and immigration. So first, let's discuss the decision to immigrate or to migrate. When we discuss this, we have to think first in terms of the human capital equation, so we have to weigh the costs and the benefits. We need to think about costs and opportunities of migration. We need to think about worker and location indifference and ISO benefit curves. These aren't expressly different from the indifference and ISO profit curves that we experienced in a prior module, but they're a little bit, and I think you'll see the difference. It's a nuance at best. We'll look then at some immigration statistics, and then we'll talk about the least likely within societies or within the workforce to migrate. First, let's recall the human capital decision, and recall that immigration is one of the three inputs to human capital. So if that's true, what we're really saying is migration is one of the three inputs to human capital. So going from one location to another in an effort to capture some additional productivity advantage and or compensation advantage because of the ability to capture some marginal revenue productivity gains. So think about it in this case, we're looking at this concept of present value, and we know the present value is going to be equal to the costs of migration plus the benefits in migration. And recall that costs are expressly negative. So really it's benefits minus costs if you look at it in kind of a mathematical sense. And what we're really trying to think about here is how does present value relate to zero? Is it greater than zero, equal than zero, or less than zero? So we know that the benefits of immigration or migration would be the opportunity to have employment, to have a labor contract in which the productivity that this particular worker brings with them will be paid closer to what their real value is in a productive marketplace. So if I live in a very small town, let's say it's Hennifer, Utah, where there's very little employment. In fact, I have to commute rather a long distance to have any kind of a decent job. And even then, I'm in a relatively small labor market compared to some of the big labor markets nationally, such as Chicago and Miami and Washington, D.C. and Dallas and Los Angeles and Seattle, Washington, etc. So I might choose to move, uproot my family, uproot my whole lifestyle from Hennifer, Utah, a place near the mountains that's beautiful, and go to maybe Chicago to take a job doing the exact same work that I'm qualified to do in Hennifer, but where I have to commute, say, an hour or so, and maybe that'll put me in Ogden, Utah, still a very small labor market where the opportunities are rather limited, but now I've gone to Chicago, where in Chicago there's numerous firms that require the skill sets that I bring with me, and I'm able to garner a closer to market level wage, closer to marginal revenue product wage. But to do so, I need to have some costs, the cost of relocation, etc. And so I can't forget what those costs are. Let me think about those costs for a minute. There are relocation costs. So the actual move, transportation of people and belongings from point A to point B. If we're dealing with immigration, some of those relocation costs include immigration and naturalization service activity. They include securing visas, passports, etc. We have cost of living differences. My guess is that it's very low cost of living in Hennifer, Utah compared to Chicago. Chicago is one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. So we have some cost of living differences that we have to think about. We have to think about the psychic cost of loss of social networks, loss of family, lots of friends. We might even think about the long-term cost of the loss of those social networks, because those social networks in many cases are also some of our very important business networks. We have to think about the improved labor market conditions. So that's not expressly a negative cost. It might even be a benefit. We have to think about the benefit of knowledge transfers. So what's a knowledge transfer? A knowledge transfer is that which a worker receives by working around other workers doing similar or complementary work. So if I'm doing this work I'm qualified to do, or maybe I'm doing something close to what I'm qualified to do in the Hennifer market, or maybe in Ogden, Utah, and now I've gone to Chicago, it's likely that there's a lot of innovation and activity and technological advancement in the Chicago market that may not be present in my Ogden or Hennifer, Utah market. And because it's not present in the Ogden or Hennifer markets, I don't have an awful lot of opportunity to have knowledge transfers by virtue of interacting with others that are working with these innovations, that are on the cutting edge of technology, and so I don't get to benefit from those associations. We might think about those in respect to social networks, or we might think about those in respect to business networks, but technically we think of them as knowledge transfers. It's a form of informal on-the-job training or workplace training that may or may not come at a cost. Different professionals will join business networks for the specific purpose of increasing their knowledge transfers. So transference of knowledge just by working with or around other workers in the same kind of marketplace. And then that relates, of course, directly to leveraging business hubs. So we have some costs and benefits, or costs and opportunities with respect to this. So let's think about this issue for a moment of indifference curves and ISO benefits curves. We're going to consider this in ISO, or rather in wage and benefit space. So if we think about wage and benefit space as we've looked at it before, we have wages on the y-axis, maybe some benefits on the x-axis. And in this case, this is not going to be benefits of a firm or ISO profits. This is going to have to do with the location that we've gone to. So this is all about relocation to another area. Well, we know that in wage and benefit space, we're going to have an indifference curve for the worker that's going to look a lot like an indifference curve for a consumer in a goods market. And so it'll be downward sloping and it'll be convex. And so we'll think about this as indifference curve U1. Now, we might also think about the ISO benefit curve that exists for places like Hennifer, Utah. So I'm going to guess in Hennifer, Utah, that not only are wages relatively limited, but the socioeconomic benefits of living in Hennifer, Utah are also probably very limited. So I'm going to suppose that this ISO benefit curve, which is going to be location specific for Hennifer, might look like this. So I'll say ISO Hennifer. Might look like this. It's relatively low, so we have a low level of wage, a low level of benefit at any point on this curve, but that's just the issue of living in Hennifer, Utah. Now, it's possible that if a benefit that you derive great value from is very rural living, with lots of acreage around you, very far from your neighbors, maybe Hennifer is exactly the place you want to be. So ISO benefit curves are relative based upon the needs and desires of the worker. But in this case, if this worker has what we'll call a normalized indifference curve and is choosing to work in Hennifer, Utah, the likelihood is that their indifference curve, in order to make that choice, their indifference curve is likely at a much lower level of utility. We're going to call it utility 0, utility not, if they're working in Hennifer, Utah. However, let's say that this worker seeking greater utility, and recall that utility is a combination of wage and all the other benefits that we get by working for a particular firm, living in a particular area, etc. Let's suppose then that this particular worker chooses to move to Chicago, and that the Chicago market has an ISO benefit curve that's at a much higher level, such that wages are higher, social benefits are higher, cultural benefits are higher. Maybe the Chicago market even has some opportunity for advancement that doesn't exist in the Hennifer market. And so we see that this worker might be able to aspire to utility level 1 by making that relocation. We also have to think about what these cost curves look like for different locations where we have high ISO costs and high costs versus high benefits. So think about, again, benefit and wage space. And consider for a moment a location that might have really high wages but maybe kind of low benefits. So that might be an ISO benefit curve that looks like this. So it's really very steep. Let's say that's an ISO benefit curve of 1. Versus another location that might have low wages but extremely high social benefits and other benefits. So that's an ISO benefit 2. So the combination of wages and benefits in a locale will determine the shape of the ISO benefit curve. Well, think about it. It kind of makes sense to us that in order to get people to go to a low benefit environment, that environment might have to pay relatively high wages, such as we see with my little modeling here at W prime and benefit prime. Or conversely, a location with great benefits but lousy wages might be at W and B. My guess is that if you like rural and living, if you like lots of isolation, lots of ground around you, inexpensive acreage and housing, that this might be the Hennifer market in ISO 2, where wages in that market are probably relatively low, but if you enjoy those rural accoutrements, then the benefits, at least to you, would be rather high. We might even think of another market where wages and benefits are both relatively high. This might be a big city market, in which case we might see the ISO benefit curve normalize out something like this. So we'll call that ISO 3, in which case we're going to have a significant level of wage, a significant level of benefit, but you can also suppose that this is going to come with a significant cost of living. And each of these then are going to fit some different types of workers seeking different types of utilities, and all of this will be part and parcel of the decision to migrate.